Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. Today, it's time for part 2 of the Pragmatic Climate Reset, which I've called a Provocation. For those of you who've not yet listened to part 1, or watched it on YouTube or read it on Bloomberg, let me give you a brief synopsis. The election of Donald Trump to a second term as president marked a turning point in the politics of climate action, not just in the US, but around the world. The airwaves are suddenly awash with commentators claiming that the transition has failed, that it was always a fool's errand, and that we must resign ourselves to a fossil-based future forever. In part 1 of the Pragmatic Climate Reset, I took on some of those narratives from high-profile commentators Dan Yergin, Michael Sembalest of JP Morgan, and Tony Blair. I showed how they all rest on flawed analysis and rhetorical tricks, including the primary energy fallacy, mixing investment figures with cost figures, ignoring investment requirements of a fossil counterfactual, the impact of unchecked climate change on energy assets, and so on. These narratives of failure all revel in pointing out that we've not yet seen dramatic cuts in fossil fuel use, the sort of cuts that would be consistent with keeping the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, and we're not on track to achieve global net zero by 2050. They all claim that this shows new energy technologies are only ever additive, ignoring the evidence of history and the trajectory of the world's advanced economies. Because the fact is that clean energy is already more than meeting all the increase in demand for energy in the G7, which is a big reason why their emissions are dropping. Of course, it's not yet happening globally, although emissions may well have peaked 18 months ago in China. So, what I did in part 1 was to show, using a simple 4-line Excel model, what happens as long as growth in clean energy continues to outpace the growth in global energy demand, even by a relatively slim margin, over the coming decades. What happens is fossil fuels are inexorably, eventually, squeezed out of the system. So, transitioning like a hare may have failed, but it would be very unwise to declare that we're not transitioning like a tortoise. Nonetheless, there is no cause for complacency. The climate and clean energy community is facing a choice. It can remain reactive, doubling down on old narratives, pressing on with existing policies, preaching to the converted, and watching the pace of change slow for the next few years. Or it can undertake what I call the pragmatic climate reset, wind back historical overreach, accept harsh realities, address legitimate concerns, refresh its offer, and find new ways of communicating with a confused public. Now, what follows is not meant to be read as a manifesto. What I'm trying to do is present some ideas across 8 different areas of climate action: politics, targets, energy priorities, hydrogen, science, diplomacy, finance, and regulation. My intention is to start a critical and perhaps long overdue conversation about what a pragmatic climate reset might actually involve. Before we get started, as always, I'd like to thank Bloomberg for letting me produce these audio versions of the pieces I write for them. Job number 1 in the pragmatic climate reset is climate politics. It's easy to blame polarization on the oil and gas industry, libertarian think tanks, and legacy media. However, the reality is that the climate and clean energy community bears its own share of the blame for this situation. Stop talking down to people. Stop trying to make them feel guilty. Stop using implausible scenarios to scare them. Stop disrupting their commutes. Stop using the terminology of anti-Nazism to demonize them. Stop using climate and the environment to signal group membership or to score political points. And above all, stop treating taxpayers and consumers like hostages at a cash machine, forced to withdraw savings in order to fund priorities they don't share. The transition will not succeed without the support of the sensible centre. This is where most hard-working, asset-owning people reside, as well as the majority of executives and investors. And these people are not ignorant and inattentive about climate change, to use the words of blogger and podcaster David Roberts. They are smart and they are concerned. So next time someone says they think climate change is happening but it's natural, or that there's nothing we can do about it, or that whatever we could do would cost too much, or that only some imagined technology holds the answer, don't misread them. The chances are what they're really saying is that they fear the current approach will lead to an increased cost of living. It will lead to expansion of the state and the empowerment of unelected elites. And yet, most likely, it will still fail to solve the problem. And looking around you, hand on heart, can you say that those fears are unfounded? Winning back the sensible centre demands a new approach, focused on self-interest, fairness, and harmony. Self-interest, that's the knowledge that families can still prosper in a low-carbon world. It's not crony climate capitalism. Fairness, the sense that injustices are being reduced and risks averted. It's not climate lawfare. And harmony is the feeling that the places we love, the society and cultures we grew up in, will endure beyond our time. It's not about environmental fundamentalism. To win the politics, stop taking the knee to Greta Thunberg and start worrying about energy bills. The second element of the pragmatic climate reset is climate targets. It's time to put the decade of 1.5 degrees behind us. A little bit of history. Let's go back to early 2015, a few months before the COP21 climate talks in Paris. Countries have agreed to limit the global temperature increase to 2 degrees, but have not yet turned that figure into an emissions target. The UK, the most progressive economy in the developed world, was still targeting an 80% reduction under its pioneering 2008 Climate Change Act. In June that year, the leaders of the G7 met in Schloss Elmau in Germany as guests of the then German Chancellor Angela Merkel. When the closing communiqué appeared, it contained this bombshell, I quote, "We emphasize that deep cuts in global greenhouse gas emissions are required, with a decarbonization of the global economy over the course of this century." The political enthronement of net zero had begun. But that enthronement went too far. The Paris Agreement only promised to, quote, hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2°C, above pre-industrial levels. However, in order to secure support from the coalition of small island developing states, and this is something I discussed with a number of the key protagonists in a series of early cleaning up episodes, it also included a commitment to, quote, pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And this set in train a series of events, starting with the publication by the IPCC of the SR15 report in October 2018. And this documented for the first time the considerable climate impacts that could be avoided by remaining under 1.5 degrees centigrade. It also pointed out that keeping to 1.5 degrees would mean cutting emissions by 45% from a 2010 baseline by 2030, which is around a 50% reduction from the 2018 figure, and reaching net zero by 2050. These goals were immediately seized on by Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, and other activists who were enjoying their moment in the sun. Net zero by 2050 was adopted by politicians, executives, and investors in an orgy of virtue signalling ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. But how many of them spared a thought for how much it would actually cost? Energy and transport assets can have lifetimes of 30 years or more. Reducing emissions by half in just 12 years would mean inevitably writing off trillions of dollars in productive assets, the economic impact of which was not even captured in the IPCC's analysis. What the IPCC SR15 report did show, however, as long as you scrolled to page 152 of Chapter 2, was the impact on marginal carbon prices. In the 2C scenario, those prices might rise to $225 per tonne of CO2. That's in 2010 dollars by 2030. But under 1.5 degrees centigrade, they could go as high as $6,050 per tonne, and that is obviously a huge difference. What it means is that adopting the 1.5 degrees C target meant promising the premature retirement of around half of existing energy assets and throwing money at anything with the slightest chance of reducing emissions at any cost. It shouldn't be at all surprising that so many people now associate climate action with a profligate waste of public money and an elite indifference to energy bills. And the irony is that the world went mad for 1.5 degrees at almost exactly the moment that it became clear it could not be achieved. My first public statements that 1.5 degrees was no longer on the table can be dated back to 2018. Now today, it's 10 years since that G7 meeting in Schloss Elmau. The planet has either passed the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold or will do so in the next few years. Yet, commitment to 1.5 degrees still serves as an article of faith for the climate community, and that has to change. Let me be quite clear. It's not that 1.5 degrees of warming won't have devastating impacts. Indeed, we're already seeing them. But that doesn't make it a credible target. Continuing to adhere to it leads to terrible policy decisions and undermines public support. It's time to switch back to the hard 2 degrees target that lies at the heart of the Paris Agreement. Now, there are a couple of caveats. First, to avoid exceeding 2 degrees of warming, we do still need to reach net zero, just a bit later. So, advanced economies still need to target 2050, China still needs to target 2060, India still needs to target 2070, just as they all promised in Glasgow in 2021. Second, if all countries get to within 5 or 10% of their targets, that will be pretty good going. If it's not enough, we can always course correct along the way, following what's called in the climate jargon an adaptive pathway, using technologies and wealth generated over the coming decades. So the target really needs to be net zero-ish rather than net zero absolute. The third area for the pragmatic climate reset is how we think about our energy system. The short version is we should focus on decarbonising the first 90% as quickly and affordably as possible, rather than letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. On one level, decarbonisation is simple. Switch to clean electricity and electrify almost everything. All the low-carbon pathways ever modelled have this approach at their heart. Now, regular listeners will already know that we can electrify huge additional swathes of the economy at modest or no cost. Land transport, domestic and commercial heating, low to mid-temperature industrial heat, and thermal processes that can switch to electrochemistry. We even know how to decarbonize high-temperature industrial heat using commercially available technologies, particularly if we're prepared to pay a modest carbon price. The challenge is inertia, a lack of skills, immature supply chains, resistance to behavioral change, existing high-carbon assets, lags in capital formation, lobbying, regulatory capture. These are all things that are hard to fix quickly, but which fix themselves with the passing of decades and generations. And as for decarbonising electricity, every country in the world is already doing it, even those with no commitment to climate action. So, a decade ago, coal provided 39% of US power. Last year, it was 15%. In the European Union, coal was at 26%. Last year, it was 10%. In the UK, it was 42% dependent on coal in 2012, and last year, the UK closed its final power station. Even in China, coal was at 73% of power 10 years ago. In the first quarter of 2025, it was under 60%. So, China may still be building new power stations, but is also shutting old ones and using the ones it has less and less. And over that same decade, wind and solar generation have soared by a factor of 18, making them the fastest growing new source of electricity in history by a wide margin. This quarter, wind and solar together will meet just under 20% of global power demand. Nuclear is growing too, but much more slowly, even in countries trying to build it as fast as possible. The global solar industry now has enough capacity to manufacture 2 terawatts of panels per year, enough to replace 10% of fossil-based power, and will soon be installing 1 terawatt annually. The multi-decadal decline in solar and wind costs, briefly interrupted by the recent spike in inflation, has resumed. Costs are below those of new-built coal or gas plants practically everywhere, and in many places below the cost of running existing plants. Last year saw around 1 terawatt-hour of batteries manufactured, up by a factor of 26 over the last decade. To put this in context, 1 terawatt-hour is enough to meet global power needs for around half an hour. Models show that around 4 hours of storage is enough for most grids to ride through most daily variations in supply and demand. EV batteries are increasingly being used to provide flexibility, and grid-connected storage is increasingly co-located with renewable generation. 10 more years of battery growth and the grid will be a completely different animal. Soon, the only remaining challenges to complete decarbonisation of the grid will be industry, seasonality, and longer duration resilience. In countries with good resources, a combination of renewables with batteries will soon deliver dispatchable power more cheaply and reliably than coal or natural gas. So that's a big chunk of industry simply sorted out. According to estimates from think tank Ember, very sunny regions can already have power from solar and batteries 97% of the time at $104 per megawatt hour, down 22% from last year. And Abu Dhabi is building the first gigawatt of base load solar in the world. Seasonality will most likely end up being solved by overbuilding. That's what happens in every other sector of transport, energy, infrastructure, and the built environment. This tide of cheap, clean electricity is unstoppable. In the 11th century, after his failed attempt to stop the waters, King Canute declared that all the inhabitants of the world should know that the power of kings is vain and trivial. And President Trump and his Energy Secretary Chris Wright should take note. And that leaves only the question of long-duration resilience. In 2022, Trio Mai and his colleagues at the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory showed that the cost of decarbonizing nearly 90% of the US grid would only be around $125 per ton of carbon dioxide in 2022 dollars. It's only after that point that it gets expensive, reaching $1,000 or more per ton to get to 100%. And similar results have been found for many other geographies, including the UK, Germany, and Australia. I used to reject outright the idea of gas as a transition fuel, but part of the pragmatic climate reset is to be more nuanced. If you simply replace big inflexible coal plants with big inflexible gas plants, you achieve an immediate halving of emissions, as the gas industry is fond of pointing out. The problem is, you're then locked in for the life of that plant, and, given the scale of the infrastructure serving it, perhaps forever. However, if you replace inflexible coal plants with flexible gas plants, then, as long as regulation makes the owners indifferent to the number of hours of operation, there is no such lock-in. So, you might start with the flexible gas generation meeting 25% of the grid's output, but as you continue to add very cheap wind, solar, demand response and batteries, and nuclear if you can get the numbers to work, you can continue to push down gas usage until your grid is 90% or more decarbonized. In fact, modeling shows that many grids could keep going all the way below 5% of that flexible gas generation in this way. This would be a huge result for the climate for relatively modest cost. There is an additional benefit of leaving flexible gas capacity on the system. It can also help with grid stability. The power cut that hit Spain and Portugal on April the 28th this year was not caused by renewables. In fact, those who seize on power cuts, as they have in Spain, the UK, Australia, Texas, California, Chile, and elsewhere, as evidence that grids can only be stable if they rely on fossil or nuclear plants, they have been proven wrong every time. Now, Spain's headlong rush to wind and solar, which were meeting 64% of demand at the moment of failure, had reduced the amount of inertia on the system. But the issue that brought the grid down was the arcana of voltage oscillations. The fact is, Spain's grid codes, the rules by which market participants feed in or draw out power, had not kept up with the rapidly changing power mix. There was a culture of non-compliance by market participants, and too much was being asked of a very weak interconnection to France. So it is perfectly feasible for renewable resources and batteries to provide grid stability services, and we should expect them to do so. But flexible gas capacity can help too, even at times when it's not needed to generate power. Gas engines and turbines can be decoupled from generators, leaving them spinning but neither consuming nor generating power. Then, when grid frequency changes, they provide inertia, but they can also provide reactive power, short-circuit current, black start capability, and a range of other useful services. And unlike a system that provides all grid stability services with just renewables and batteries, one with flexible gas generation will also be able to ride through longer emergencies or renewable outages. If society decides at some later point that we need to go all the way to a 100% decarbonized grid, we will face a very well-defined challenge: replacing the last few percent of flexible gas generation and the associated stability services. Doing so would require vast investment and incur high maintenance costs. But it may be that by then we're so wealthy and the impact of climate change is so obvious that we decide to spend the money. But we have an option. It may be that we decide instead to do carbon removal, or to help laggard regions first, or maybe we'll have other priorities like defense or adaptation. So the fact is, how to decarbonize those last few percent of the grid is simply not a question we need to answer today. Now, as always, there are some caveats to all this. I've oversimplified. Some sectors cannot be decarbonized via electrification, shipping, aviation, process emissions from cement and the like. However, these account for less than 15% of global emissions. And even here, a pragmatic climate reset means focusing on rapid and cheap progress and not technological purity. So, for instance, 40% of shipping goes away if we stop shipping coal and oil around the world. Then, using LNG, biogas, or streamlining operations can reduce shipping emissions far more rapidly than ammonia or synthetic methanol. Similarly, aviation emissions can be slashed via more efficient planes, improved operations, biofuels, contrail management, and carbon removal, supported, by the way, by appropriate taxation and the removal of subsidies. It won't get us all the way to zero emissions from aviation, but it could cap their emissions near where they are today, a few percent of the global total. When it comes to industrial process emissions, in the end, we'll have to tackle them probably via carbon capture and storage. But first, we can be more efficient. We can switch to clean electricity. We could substitute to lower carbon building materials like cross-laminated timber. We could finally get serious about plastics recycling, or we could just accept that putting plastic waste in a well-managed landfill is a form of carbon sequestration, and so on. And that brings us to the fourth area of our pragmatic climate reset, and that is our old friend, hydrogen. In all my decades as an analyst, I have never seen such a big disconnect between the physics and economics of what a solution can deliver and the politics of what is being asked of it. But why should we care if hydrogen is being hyped? Because if you wanted to delay the transition, you would promote a solution that sounds perfect but doesn't work. A fuel that is ubiquitous, easy to make, produces only water when burned, will get cheaper and cheaper, provides jobs, and solves every problem, from cars to rockets, from transport to fertilizer, from steel to seasonal storage. Hydrogen even has an extra feature attractive to politicians and grifters everywhere. It takes years and years for it to become clear that it is unaffordable, particularly if you can get the public to ignore 50 years of wasted public funds. Now, the hydrogen souffle is beginning to deflate under its own weight. At the end of last year, the European Court of Auditors found that the targets in the EU's 2020 hydrogen strategy were, and I quote, driven by political will rather than being based on robust analyses, and called for a reality check. In January this year, France's state auditor, the Cour des Comptes, estimated the country's hydrogen strategy implies a cost of carbon of at least €520 per tonne, and even jeopardizes France's national finances. In July, Bloomberg chronicled the smoking crater that is Australia's hydrogen landscape, entitled The $147 billion Green Hydrogen Bubble that BP helped burst. Nevertheless, there is still a need for a full-on hydrogen reset. It is time to admit that green hydrogen will play at most a tiny bit part in a future low-carbon energy system. It's not just that it's currently expensive to produce. The point that so many people are missing is that it has no plausible pathway to affordability. So, of course, electrolyzer stacks will exhibit the same sort of learning rates as solar PV and batteries. But the stacks are responsible for only around 10% of the cost of green hydrogen. Another 40% is electricity, and 40% is heavy engineering, electrical, chemical, and civil. And their costs are not about to plummet by 3 to 10 times, which is what would be required to make green hydrogen cheaper than other clean solutions. And that is only the production of hydrogen. You also have to add the cost of compression, transport, distribution, usage, and safety management. Now, if your plan is to make ammonia locally from cheap wind or solar, or to feed green hydrogen directly into a refinery, you either have to add the costs of batteries to smooth your power supply, or the cost of compression and buffer storage to meet the 24/7, 365 demands of your downstream plant. If you're exporting, you'll need pipelines and deep water port infrastructure. Green ammonia could perhaps eventually be viable in some places, but only where dispatchable green power is very cheap, natural gas is very expensive, and there's a local market for fertilizer. China and India come to mind, but even there, the current crop of projects are only going ahead because in China, state-owned enterprises have been ordered to pursue hydrogen even at a loss. And in India, ammonia producers are able to stack subsidy on subsidy. The numbers simply don't add up, not even for Saudi Arabia's NEOM mega project. What about green steel? Well, it's simply not urgent. Switch primary iron production to natural gas direct reduction, and you get 75% of the climate benefit at a fraction of the cost of hydrogen direct reduction. We should also keep working on direct electrical reduction and bio-coking coal, which promise to be cheaper and more flexible in terms of ore grades than hydrogen. How about e-fuels? There is simply no way they will ever be cheap enough to replace petrol or diesel or to compete with electrification. It's obvious, really, because you can't gather the products of combustion and reassemble them into a fuel at anything within a country mile of the original cost of that fuel. And you can't make something from electricity which is cheaper than electricity. Germany needs to stop the charade of Technologieoffenheit, or technology openness, before it witnesses the implosion of its entire automotive industry. Hydrogen aviation. It's a dead parrot. Even Airbus seems to have understood. Building the plane turns out not to be the problem, although it would carry half the passengers because, of course, it would be full of hydrogen and insulation. The problem is there is simply no plausible way of getting liquid hydrogen to major airports at the scale required to run an airline. So what about sustainable airline fuel made from hydrogen with captured carbon, so-called eSAF? Well, according to the EU's own figures, it currently costs 12 times more than jet fuel. That means blending 1% will drive up fuel cost by 12% and flight costs by 4%, while achieving almost nothing for the climate. And since it's made in chemicals plants with electricity as a feedstock, although its costs can come down, there is no plausible pathway to an order of magnitude cost reduction. Blending hydrogen into the grid, I have called the stupidest idea from Stupidville, and I simply can't improve on that. You're making a chemical feedstock for €6 or €10 per kilo, and then instantly reducing it to its value as a provider of heat, which is less than €2 per kilo. And at the same time, you're driving up the costs to all other gas users, and you're committing yourself to a pathway that cannot get beyond 6% decarbonisation without building a whole new pipeline network. Frankly, it beggars belief that blending is being supported by governments. It is quite simply a gross failure of public policy. Now, does this change if we get white or geological hydrogen? Well, at this point, geological hydrogen is an interesting field for scientific research. It certainly exists, but it probably can't be extracted at a meaningful flow rate. Even if it can, unless it can be extracted at high purity, it's just slightly lower carbon natural gas. And if the resource isn't big enough to last 40 years, you can't build a pipeline, so you can't get it to the point of demand. And if it won't last 20 years, you can't build a local fertilizer plant. Wishful thinking about geological hydrogen is not an energy strategy. Now, we do need to decarbonize 100 million tons of current hydrogen demand, which is causing around 2.3% of global emissions today. But since green hydrogen will always cost at least $2 per kilo more than fossil-based hydrogen, switching to it would mean finding $200 billion per year of additional money, equivalent to the entire global aid budget. And since you need 15-year offtake agreements to secure project finance, you're looking for $3 trillion of upfront bankable support, as I explained in our episode called Hydrogen's Missing Trillions. And that is 3 orders of magnitude more than any public money available today. So the only affordable approach to decarbonizing current use cases is by means of hydrogen from natural gas with the carbon captured and sequestered. And of course, we have to do that right. Of course, we have to limit fugitive methane emissions to less than 0.2%. And of course, we have to achieve 95% or more carbon capture and sequestration. That means that society needs to demand that producers meet these stringent targets instead of falling for activist claims that they are physically unachievable. Now, luckily, there's a silver lining to the inevitable failure of green hydrogen. It will be good for the planet. Every wind and solar project developer has to decide whether to sell electricity from their project or make hydrogen. Until such time as the world is awash with green electricity, or pink from nuclear for that matter, every kilowatt hour that is used to make hydrogen could deliver 2 to 9 times the emissions reductions if used directly, at a fraction of the capital investment and maintenance cost. And so that is what the Pragmatic Climate Reset demands that we do. Cleaning Up is supported by its leadership circle. The members are Actis, Alcazar Energy, Arup, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Eurelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse the archive of over 200 past episodes, and also to subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live. The 5th area of the Pragmatic Climate Reset is diplomacy, the UNFCCC, and the COP process. In November 2011, I wrote a piece for Bloomberg NEF called Ya Basta! Time to Call Time on the COP Show. My argument was that the failure of 17 successive COP meetings to produce a global deal was actually harming the meteoric rise of clean energy that Bloomberg NEF was chronicling. 4 years later, at COP21, the Paris Agreement was signed, and in a piece entitled "We'll Always Have Paris," I had to admit that, quote, in retrospect, I'm very glad no one listened to me. I'm older and wiser today, so I'm not going to call for the UNFCCC or even the COP process to be abandoned. But climate diplomacy most certainly needs a pragmatic reset. My very first experience of COP meetings was COP14 in Poznan, Poland, in 2008. When I turned up, a subcommittee of the 9,000 delegates was debating whether to reopen the previous year's agreement on the position of a comma. I kid you not. They were still at it a year later at COP15 in Copenhagen. There, 27,000 delegates famously enjoyed freezing weather, poor food, traffic jams and huge lines, and produced nothing of measurable benefit to the climate. Back in Poland for COP19 in 2013, the hosts enraged the activist community by inviting businesses, including Polish coal-producing ones, to participate. By 2015, COP21 in Paris, side events were everywhere and delegate numbers had swelled to 30,000. COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 saw 38,000 delegates, of which an undisclosed proportion, of course, caught COVID-19, at what I would argue was only the second breakthrough COP in history, with Paris 2015, of course, being the other one. The 3 COP meetings since then have been hosted by oil and gas exporters, Egypt, UAE and Azerbaijan. COP28 in Dubai was in some ways the UNFCCC's Woodstock, with 84,000 delegates. We spent much of the week stuck in taxis, checking on our phones to see if the world would pretend to phase out unabated fossil fuels or only pretend to transition away from them. After decades of negotiations, a loss and damage fund was agreed, but it raised less than 0.1% of the market value of Saudi Aramco. Then, last year's COP29 in Baku was held in the shadow of President Trump's re-election promise to exit the Paris Agreement for a second time. Instead of acknowledging reality, leaders of the remaining Western democracies promised to invest $300 billion per year in developing countries by 2035. What were they thinking? The COP's simplistic rich country, poor country classification is stuck in the last century. Today, supposedly rich countries are full of people suffering economic hardship from stagnant incomes, a cost of living crisis, persistent inflation, low growth, and an ongoing European war. Meanwhile, many supposedly poor countries have skyscrapers, space programs, global multinationals, oligarchs owning European football clubs, middle classes taking international holidays, and millions of kids attending Western universities. It is astonishingly tin-eared for G7 leaders to fly off to Baku and promise to invest hundreds of billions of dollars per year in their emerging economic rivals, receiving nothing but a handful of climate indulgences in return. The single best thing that developed countries can do to ensure the decarbonization of South Africa, Indonesia, or wherever would be to succeed in decarbonizing their own economies while preserving their own population's standard of living. Do that, and the whole world will follow. Fail, and no amount of conferences or communiques on North-South climate finance will make any difference. So, what might a pragmatic climate reset of the UNFCCC or COP process look like? A full answer would require a lot more words than you want to read, but here are some ideas. First of all, hold the annual meeting on an island with no more than 5,000 hotel rooms, and a broader meeting only once every 5 years. Demand that delegations be led by ministers of finance, ministers of energy, or ministers of trade, rather than ministers of environment or ministers of climate. Stop pretending that plenary decisions are binding. No decisions by the UNFCCC are truly binding. move from consensus to qualified majority voting. That alone would shorten meetings from 2 weeks to 1 week. Focus on sectoral deals in industry, energy, and transport, rather than economy-wide agreements. Move land use, land change, and forestry, or as it's called, LULUCF, into its own convention. The social, cultural, and political importance of land means no government will ever let the tail of climate negotiations wag the dog of national priorities. Shut down the loss and damage track. It makes no sense to build a duplicate aid infrastructure, particularly when losses cannot be unambiguously linked to climate change. Climate models, which cannot predict individual storms, floods, fires, or droughts, cannot be used retroactively to quantify the contribution of climate to their cause, no matter how many activist scientists tell you they can. Nearly 20 years ago, I wrote a piece explaining that climate change is not a simple prisoner's dilemma, but a repeated multiplayer game, which means that the winning strategy is, to quote Robert Axelrod's Evolution of Cooperation, to be nice, retaliatory, forgiving, and clear. And that means the role of the UNFCCC is to act as coach and mediator. It needs to refocus on creating platforms for sectoral, bilateral, and multilateral negotiations, and not try to deliver global economic government by means of emissions policy. Area 6 of the Pragmatic Climate Reset is science. In 2018, I launched a hashtag, RCP85IsBollocks, to draw attention to the implausibility of the worst-case emissions scenario used throughout climate research. 2 years later, climate scientists Zeke Hausfather and Glenn Peters published Emissions, the business-as-usual story is misleading in Nature, agreeing that RCP 8.5 needed to be retired. And yet, RCP 8.5 and its modern analogue SSP 585 remains the most popular scenario in the climate literature, even today. And this is a scandalous failure of science to self-correct. The reason I made such a fuss about RCP 8.5 back then was that it creates a trivially easy attack surface for opponents of climate action. And sure enough, in his presidential order called Restoring Gold Standard Science, President Trump specifically named RCP 8.5, citing academic research from 2017 that showed how reaching it would involve burning more coal than exists in the world's recoverable reserves. On this matter, though it pains me to say it, President Trump is right. Another case in point is the Critical Review of Impacts of Greenhouse Gas Emissions, the report by 5 known climate skeptics, intended to serve as the evidence base to revoke the EPA's endangerment finding. There is much to criticize about this report, without doubt. However, it should also be noted that the original endangerment finding was based on science dating back before 2009, using scenarios that were even more extreme than RCP 8.5. No one truly committed to science-based decision-making should object to a review in the light of another 15 years' worth of additional research and data. The focus should be on making sure that such a review is objective, in which case there seems little doubt the endangerment finding would remain in place, rather than rejecting a review out of hand and claiming that such an exercise is entirely and completely without merit. Today, the IPCC is about to sign off on a new set of scenarios to be used for its next assessment report, AR7, due out in 2029. Despite stipulating that its scenarios must be plausible, the IPCC imposes no peer-reviewed test of plausibility. The worst-case scenario, which they're about to endorse, is no more plausible today than RCP 8.5 was 7 years ago. And I'm afraid this suggests the failure to self-correct is not accidental, but intentional. the pragmatic climate reset doesn't mean dismantling the entire edifice of climate science, but it does mean reforming it. IPCC scenarios really must be plausible from an energy systems perspective, and they must focus on the landing zone to which we might actually be headed, between the 1.8 degrees, which would still count as well below 2 degrees of the Paris Agreement, and the 3.5 degrees that is now the plausible worst case, and which, by the way, US Secretary of Energy Chris Wright says would be fine and dandy based on the modelling by William Nordhaus, which won him the Nobel Prize. Above all, scientists need to stop trying to scare people, and they need to focus on informing them. Let society do the rest. Area 7. Sustainable Finance. The idea that you can squeeze CO2 emissions out of the real economy or achieve environmental goals by means of financial regulation and central bank interventions has surely been tried and found wanting. At COP26 in Glasgow, no fewer than 60 multilateral organisations were promoting the use of finance as a way to bend the arc of the global economy towards net zero. Towering over them was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, whose members managed assets worth $130 trillion. It didn't work. Threats of legal action led to the withdrawal of major names and a severe pruning of the thicket of organisations and initiatives. In late 2024, a US coalition of Republican states launched lawsuits against leading asset managers, later joined by the US Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, claiming that they were violating antitrust and consumer protection laws and using ESG issues as a way of driving up energy prices in order to boost their investment returns. Even in regulation-loving Europe, the tide has turned against ESG. Just as I warned in 2021, the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities turned out to be, and I quote, a considerable overreach, and attempts to get asset managers to report on Scope 3 emissions were, quote, simply a mess. So last year, after complaints of excessive bureaucracy from France, Germany, and other countries, the European Commission and the European Banking Authority were forced to hack back reporting requirements. The whole edifice of ESG has descended into little more than a box-ticking exercise. While it may be possible to identify the life cycle carbon emissions of a single product or project, when it comes to a company or investment portfolio, it is simply impossible. I'll give you one example close to my heart. How would the investors in new energy finance have rated the emissions impact of the initial £1 million we raised in January 2006? We were using grid power in the office, most of which was still from coal and gas, and we were flying to conferences and client meetings. Not good. However, over the next 20 years, new energy finance, which is of course now Bloomberg NEF, became the most trusted information provider to investors pouring trillions of dollars into climate solutions. That first £1 million may have been the single most effective climate investment in history, yet not one of today's ESG methodologies would have given it a pass mark. So we need to get back to basics. Now, companies are not vehicles for delivering social outcomes or justice. They are vehicles to produce products and services valued by customers. Of course, they have to respect the spirit and letter of the law. They have to generate returns for their investors, and they have to treat staff and other stakeholders fairly. There's no evidence that becoming a so-called B Corp improves behavior. Asset managers allocate capital into well-run businesses, provide custodianship on behalf of asset owners and other beneficiaries, and treat all other stakeholders fairly. Investment regulation needs to align with those goals and stop trying to save the world. Policymakers need to stop using the financial system to discriminate against organizations that are active in politically unpopular parts of the economy. If they want different outcomes, they need to regulate the real economy. Activists too. Stop claiming oil and gas companies cause emissions, especially if you yourself haven't yet switched to green power, electric heating, and no-fly holidays. We are all the cause of emissions, and we all have to be the solution. It's time to retire the term ESG. Once you get beyond issues of basic fairness, which by the way is delivered through strong leadership in a healthy corporate culture with robust HR processes, ESG is about nothing more than risk and opportunity. And every board and every management team needs to understand the full set of issues that could destroy their business or present extraordinary opportunities. The fact that some of them may stem from environmental, social, or governance factors doesn't justify a different department. Fire the consultants and the box tickers. Reassign the corporate sustainability officer. Focus on the issues, not the process. The role of central banks is to maintain sound money and a dynamic, flexible economy. That's it. It is not their role to ensure the country meets environmental, social, industrial, or other targets. That is the role of government. If political leaders fail to create appropriate regulations to enable capital formation around desired solution, it is not up to central banks to second-guess them. The eighth and final aspect of the pragmatic climate reset is the sausage-making of policy and regulation. And here are just a few thought starters. Remember what we learnt in part 1. If clean energy grows 3% faster each year than total demand for energy services and keeps it up for decades, fossil fuels will be squeezed off the system in a time frame broadly consistent with 2 degrees. So the overwhelming priority is to maintain growth in clean energy year in and year out. Policies designed to restrict investment in fossil fuel supply are just a recipe for energy price inflation and social pushback. Without investment, global oil and gas output would decline at over 10% per year. Even with investment in existing fields alone, the decline would still be 4 to 6% per year. Now, once clean energy can meet demand growth, fossil fuels will decline off the system. But until then, climate justice demands that we let them keep energy costs down and the public on board. Next up, all new climate-related grants, subsidies and regulations need to pass a value for money test based on a cost per tonne of CO2 avoided. The calculation must include the contribution of overlapping measures to make explicit the impact of multiple subsidies, and it should be repeated at 5-year intervals. For solutions that are already competitive with fossil fuels, if you include relevant carbon prices, policies should focus on removing barriers, not on providing more funding. For solutions that are not yet competitive, these may still deserve funding or regulatory support, but only if they can demonstrate a plausible pathway to a carbon price of no more than $250 per tonne within a decade. And this has to be peer-reviewed and published ahead of any funding decision. Solutions that cannot meet the plausible pathway to $250 a tonne in a decade value for money test may still receive funding, but only for R&D or pilots. They are simply not ready for prime time and must not receive funding or regulatory support for scale-up or rollout. Investors who disagree with the findings of the value for money test are more than welcome to invest their own money and come back later with better evidence of a cost reduction pathway. Each measure, providing public funding or creating a regulation-driven market, must include a sunset clause. If it doesn't deliver as promised, if it's not on track to deliver the expected cost reductions at any 5-year milestone, the measure should automatically be suspended. Any mechanism supporting asset investment needs to be focused on the point when assets are reaching the end of their life and need to be replaced anyway. There is a huge cost difference between replacing a fully functioning boiler, car, power plant, or piece of industrial equipment and one that is fully depreciated. Conversely, if no one were ever again to purchase a fossil-burning asset, the world would be on track to net zero in one asset cycle. Think about it. Public statements relating to the cost of climate action need to differentiate carefully between total investment, additional investment, and actual costs. Too often, total investment is presented as a cost, ignoring the fact that investments have a financial return, and that investment would also be required in any fossil-based counterfactual. The actual cost of climate action to consumers is usually a fraction of the total investment, and very often negative, and it's time for that story to be told loudly and clearly. Then, stop promoting fossil fuel consumption. There is a rich literature on fossil fuel subsidies, but most of it is worthless because it confuses subsidies with non-cash externalities, and it gives fossil fuels no credit for the royalties and taxes they generate. But just do the simple stuff. Stop cash subsidies. Insulate homes instead of giving people fuel allowances. Stop giving freebies to airports and tax breaks to airlines in the belief that they are magic machines for economic growth. Shift green levies and social charges from clean to fossil-based solutions, and in particular from electricity to gas. The single biggest barrier to electrification is the difference between power and gas prices. One example, with an electrical heat tariff that was no higher than 3 times the gas price, any heat pump with a coefficient of performance of 3 or more would reduce utility bills. No further policy would be required to drive their uptake. And we need to embrace locational pricing. The reason renewables reached grid competitiveness in 2015 was not just falling production costs, but also because the world adopted reverse auctions. Price signals matter. And it's time for another major shift to locational pricing. As soon as the penetration of variable renewables gets to the point that grids struggle, locational pricing matters. Incumbents hate it. Of course, they'd rather be paid wherever they build wind and solar, and whether it's generating or curtailed. So locational pricing shifts value from the supply side to the demand side, but it is essential to maintain public support for the continued growth of clean energy. And finally, let's reform the greenhouse gas protocol, the carbon accounting rules. The current rules, written in 1990, allow companies to claim they use 100% renewable power on the basis of annual matching, which means they can offset nighttime coal use with extra purchases of daytime solar power. It's absurd, and it destroys public confidence. The rules are currently under review, and they need to be tightened. In summary, I said I was not going to write a manifesto. The ideas here are only intended as a provocation. Some of them might make you feel uncomfortable, in which case I apologize. Hell, some of them make me feel uncomfortable. But this is surely a moment for frank talk, given what's going on in the world. If the climate and clean energy community wants to do more than just hunker down and watch brick after brick being kicked out of the foundations of the future clean energy economy, it needs to take control of its destiny, refresh its offer, scrape off the barnacles, and come out fighting. A pragmatic climate reset is essential if we're to maintain momentum towards a low-carbon economy over the next few years. But let me be quite clear. The goal is not to slow down. The goal is to move as fast as possible in the world as it is. As an example, no matter how much of a hurry you're in, if you've flooded the carburetor of your car, for those of you who remember what a carburetor is, pumping the accelerator will not get you to your destination any faster. In fact, the opposite. And so we need a pragmatic climate reset. The transition is dead, but long live the transition. Many thanks to you, the audience, for listening or watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please make sure you recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and anyone you think needs to hear the message and be part of the discussion. I called this part 2 of the Pragmatic Climate Reset a provocation for a reason, not to spur anger, but to provoke debate and ultimately action. So, it only remains now for me to thank our producer, Oscar Boyd, our video editor, Jamie Oliver, the team behind Cleaning Up, our leadership circle who make all this possible, and Bloomberg, who allow me to make these audio versions of the pieces I write for them. And so, please join us next week for another episode of Cleaning Up. Cleaning Up is supported by its leadership circle. The members are Actis, Alcazar Energy, Arup, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse the archive of over 200 past episodes, and also to subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live.